think once you've accepted that they're gone, then you accept your life is never going to be the same ever again.
There was a time when the world couldn't get enough of him. The boy who smiled through heartbreak, who made people believe that even royalty could feel human, warm, and real. But somewhere along the way, that spark, the effortless charm that once defined him, began to fade. The same man who once lit up crowds with laughter now seems guarded, rehearsed, and strangely fragile. Something changed, not in a single moment, but slowly, quietly, as if the brightness in his eyes dimmed without anyone noticing when it started. At first, people said it was love, a new chapter, a man breaking free from an old institution to build a life on his own terms. It sounded heroic, the modern prince stepping away from the crown to find freedom. But freedom doesn't usually look like this. It doesn't usually come with silence, distance, and the haunting emptiness that lingers behind polite smiles. The more he spoke about liberation, the less liberated he seemed. The more he tried to explain, the less we recognize the person speaking. Look closely at old interviews, old moments. There was a time he didn't think twice before laughing, joking, or breaking protocol with his wild grin. Today, every word feels measured, every movement carefully weighed. And the question no one dares to ask out loud is the one that haunts every glance. What really happened to Prince Harry? Was this transformation a choice or a slow surrender? Because somewhere between love and loyalty, between devotion and dependence, something deeper unfolded, something most people never saw coming. But the story of how a free-spirited prince became a man living behind invisible walls doesn't begin with a scandal. It begins with a shift, subtle, slow, and almost invisible. And like most transformations that change a person from the inside out, it starts quietly. Prince Harry used to be the rebel royal, the soldier who laughed in the face of formality, the brother who joked through the crown's seriousness, the man who seemed to carry his mother's warmth with his father's stubbornness. He was flawed, honest, emotional, and that's why people loved him. He wasn't perfect, and he didn't pretend to be. He lived loud, laughed freely, and showed the world that you could be royal and still be real. For years, he was the bridge between the palace and the people. Then, slowly, the bridge began to disappear. The energy that once defined him, that mischievous spark, turned into something quieter, almost restrained. His public appearances changed first. The jokes became rare. The body language closed off, and that familiar ease was replaced with stiffness. It wasn't the look of a man at peace. It was the posture of someone trying not to make a mistake. People noticed it, but few understood what they were seeing. It wasn't rebellion anymore. It was retreat. When he first stepped back from royal duties, the world thought it was his choice, a man stepping away to protect his family and mental health. And maybe that was true at first. But as time went on, the idea of freedom began to look more like isolation. The move that was supposed to open new doors somehow closed almost all of them. The royal, the soldier, the humanitarian, roles he once wore with pride, began to vanish. What replaced them was something far quieter: dependence. What's fascinating and tragic is how gradual it all was. Change doesn't come with a thunderclap. It comes as a whisper. One decision at a time, one conversation, one promise that sounds loving, but slowly shifts your world's center of gravity. It happens so slowly that even the person living it doesn't realize how far they've drifted until they look back and can't recognize who they used to be. That's the transformation we're witnessing. Not a fall, but a quiet fading. And behind that fading smile, something else was forming. A new structure, a new influence, one that promised protection but carried control. That's where the story starts to twist, not in public, but in private, where love can start to look a lot like isolation. They called it independence. The prince finally living life on his own terms, moving across the ocean, building a new home, chasing privacy and freedom. To the outside world, it sounded inspiring. But what looked like liberation from tradition may have actually been the first lock on a different kind of cage. Because isolation rarely feels like imprisonment at first. It often arrives disguised as protection, as love, as something that makes sense for us. In the early days, it seemed romantic, a couple against the world, united by shared pain and purpose. They talked about privacy, but privacy slowly became distance. The circle around them grew smaller. Familiar faces, old friends, longtime staff, even loyal allies started disappearing one by one. New people arrived, but they weren't the same. They weren't part of his world. They were part of hers. And with every new connection, an old one quietly faded away. Friends who once filled his life with laughter stopped showing up at weddings. Calls stopped coming. Traditions stopped mattering. To outsiders, it looked like a couple simplifying their lives. But to those who watched closely, it looked more like separation than simplicity. A man who once thrived in crowds was now standing alone, and he didn't even seem to notice it happening. Experts on emotional manipulation say this is often the first step. Isolation disguised as devotion. You start hearing phrases like, "They don't understand us," or "We don't need anyone else." And before long, that becomes truth. The world shrinks until the only voice that matters is the one next to you. It feels safe, but safety built on control always comes with invisible strings. Prince Harry's life changed location, but more importantly, it changed orbit. He stopped revolving around the world he knew, his family, his roots, his duty, and began revolving around one person. At first, it must have felt like peace. But peace without independence isn't peace at all. It's silence. And that silence, once comforting, soon became deafening. Because love, real love, doesn't take your world away. It expands it. And yet here was a man who had once belonged to everyone, now belonging only to one. The walls around him weren't made of stone or protocol anymore. They were built from trust, affection, and subtle control. A softer cage maybe, but a cage nonetheless. And that's where the illusion deepens, because what looks like love from the outside can sometimes be the quietest form of control on the inside. But isolation is only half the story. Once you limit someone's world, the next step is to reshape how they see that world and themselves. That's when control moves from the outside in. And for someone like Prince Harry, whose entire life has been a public narrative, control over the story is everything. Because if you can't control your own story, you lose more than just privacy. You lose your sense of truth. From the moment Harry's new life began taking shape, something else began happening behind the scenes. The couple's message, their version of events, started to dominate the conversation. Every interview, every statement, every headline was carefully worded, perfectly timed. Gone were the days when Harry spoke off the cuff, sharing unfiltered emotion. Now, his words felt rehearsed, aligned, structured, and almost synchronized. It was as though every sentence was being proofread by someone else before it ever reached the world. Observers began to notice that Harry and Meghan often spoke in the same rhythm, using the same expressions, even echoing each other's phrasing. It wasn't the natural overlap of a close couple. It felt orchestrated. The man who once charmed the public with raw honesty now spoke in carefully packaged sound bites. And that's the quiet genius of narrative control. When someone's story starts sounding more like a brand message than a personal truth, it's easy to dismiss that as media training. But the pattern ran deeper. When you constantly reshape how a person expresses themselves, you eventually reshape how they think. The difference between public image and private identity starts to blur. What begins as guidance turns into scripting. And over time, even the speaker forgets what their own voice sounds like. For Meghan, mastering narrative was survival. Coming from a world of entertainment and media strategy, she knew how to manage perception, how to turn headlines into sympathy, and controversy into opportunity. But for Harry, who had spent his life being both protected and scrutinized, this control over story became something new, something powerful and dangerous at the same time. In every public appearance, Meghan leads the tone, and Harry follows it. When she speaks, he listens. When she pauses, he nods. When she expresses emotion, he mirrors it. To most, it looks like support. But to those who understand subtle dominance, it looks like direction. Bit by bit, her narrative became their narrative. And once that happens, individuality fades. The world saw it as unity. But unity without independence isn't love. It's alignment through conditioning. And it's that conditioning that started to change not just what Harry said, but who he became. Because the moment one person controls how you tell your story, they also begin to control how you live it. And from here, the transformation moved from his words to his very being. You can tell when someone has lost themselves. It's in the small things. The way their shoulders stay slightly tense. The way their laughter feels delayed, like they're waiting to see if it's okay to laugh. The once spontaneous charm turns into hesitation. The confident voice starts to tremble ever so slightly before each sentence. That's not stage fright. That's self-doubt. The kind that doesn't come from critics, but from the person closest to you. For Prince Harry, that quiet self-doubt became visible long before most people noticed. Watch old clips of him. The way he stood, the unfiltered jokes, the natural confidence in interviews. Then compare them to more recent moments. The difference isn't subtle. His body language speaks volumes. Head lowered more often, arms crossed, hands fidgeting, eyes flicking toward Meghan before answering a question. It's not fear exactly, it's permission-seeking. As if every word must be silently approved before it leaves his mouth. This kind of erosion doesn't happen overnight. It's gradual, like waves shaping a rock, soft at first, then permanent. When a person constantly walks on emotional eggshells, their personality begins to adapt for survival. They say less. They think more. They analyze every reaction. They learn which versions of themselves are acceptable, and slowly stop showing the others. Before long, they're no longer being silenced by force, but by conditioning. And conditioning is far more powerful because it convinces you that the silence is your idea. Psychologists call this dominance by correction. It's when small interruptions, subtle corrections, or quiet disapprovals start guiding someone's behavior. Maybe it's an eye roll when they say the wrong thing. Maybe it's a sudden shift in tone. It doesn't have to be loud, just consistent. Over time, the message becomes clear. Your thoughts are safer when they match mine. That's what the world began noticing in Harry's interactions. He wasn't silenced. He was softened. His opinions seemed to fade into hers. Even when he spoke passionately, it was through her lens, her phrasing, her emotional framing. The man who once championed his mother's humanitarian causes with fiery independence now sounded more like a spokesperson for a shared brand than a man speaking his own truth. His individuality, the very trait that once made him beloved, was dissolving into a collective identity shaped by someone else. And the irony is heartbreaking. The same man who fought so hard to escape the rigid control of royal tradition now finds himself under a new kind of monarchy. Not one defined by crowns and courtiers, but by emotional dominance and narrative precision. The palace may have been replaced by California sunshine, but the feeling of control never really left. As we move forward, the story stops being about rebellion or romance. It becomes about identity and what happens when you start forgetting who you used to be. Because the deeper this goes, the less this looks like love, and the more it looks like a quiet rewriting of a person's entire existence. When someone's voice starts to fade, it's rarely just about being quiet. Silence in relationships can be a form of communication or control. It's not always about what's being said, but about what isn't allowed to be said. And for Harry, that silence became his most consistent statement. After years of being hounded by tabloids, Harry's instinct to protect his peace was understandable. But there's a fine line between protecting yourself from the noise and being convinced that the noise only stops if you stop speaking. That's the psychology of silence. When every disagreement risks emotional tension and every expression of independence threatens harmony, the human brain does something fascinating. It adapts. It starts associating peace with compliance. Psychologists refer to this as learned emotional containment. It's when someone begins to filter their words, not out of fear of punishment, but out of fear of disappointment. They start believing that harmony depends entirely on them staying agreeable. And so they shrink themselves, quietly, gradually, almost invisibly. For Harry, this transformation wasn't just visible in public appearances, it was emotional. Those who once saw him speak with unfiltered emotion now see something else: hesitation. Each answer, each glance toward Meghan, each cautious smile, they all tell the same story. A story of a man balancing his need for self-expression with his fear of disruption. And yet, it's easy to see how this dynamic forms. Meghan, a master communicator, speaks with conviction and clarity. Harry, empathetic and conflict-averse, naturally yields to that strength. It's not manipulation in the obvious sense. It's subtle reinforcement. Every time Harry adjusts his phrasing or softens his stance to match hers, it rewards stability. Over time, his brain learns agreement means safety. And that's the unspoken rule of emotional dominance. You don't force obedience. You create conditions where obedience feels like love. The silence also has a strategic layer. It keeps the world guessing. Because when you stop responding to criticism, when you avoid direct statements, mystery takes over. And mystery fuels speculation. Suddenly, every gesture, every quote, every brief appearance becomes a puzzle for the public to decode. Silence becomes power, but only for one person in the relationship. For the other, it becomes isolation. Harry's silence has become both his shield and his prison. The world interprets it as loyalty, but to those who look deeper, it seems more like self-erasure. A man trading his voice for peace, his individuality for unity. And that's the most dangerous exchange of all. when love becomes measured not by how much you're heard, but by how quietly you can stay aligned. But this silence isn't just emotional, it's strategic. Because the quieter Harry became, the louder another force began to rise. And that's where the strategy of separation began. By the time the world noticed Harry's new silence, something else had already been set in motion, something deliberate. It wasn't just about stepping away from the royal family. It was about disconnecting Harry from his anchors, the people, habits, and institutions that had once defined who he was. And when you control someone's connections, you control their reality. At first, it looked like a fresh start, a new country, a new mission, a new brand. But as with most transformations, the beauty of freedom can hide the mechanics of separation. The more distance Harry put between himself and his old life, the more dependent he became on the new one. And dependence, emotional, financial, or social, is one of the oldest tools of control. One by one, the ties that held him steady began to loosen. Old friends faded away, many reportedly feeling cut off or shut out. His bond with his brother, once unbreakable, grew distant. Even the familiar traditions that grounded him, the military events, the charities he once led, were gradually replaced by new projects, new partnerships, new circles of influence that revolved not around Harry, but around them, around the couple, around the brand. And here's where it gets subtle. When a person's entire support network shifts from individual to collective, they lose the ability to process reality independently. Every conversation, every decision, every public move passes through the filter of we. That's not just partnership, that's identity fusion. And once your identity fuses with another person's narrative, your perspective becomes replaceable. For Meghan, this alignment was natural. She thrived on reinvention. Her world had always been about self-branding, repositioning, and evolving her image. But for Harry, who grew up defined by structure, lineage, and loyalty, this fluid identity became destabilizing. And the more he tried to redefine himself outside the royal system, the deeper he fell into another kind of hierarchy. One built not on titles, but on emotional power. Even physically, the separation had layers. The move from Britain to California wasn't just geographic, it was symbolic. A quiet exile wrapped in sunshine. The place represented freedom, but also served as a soft barrier from the people who might remind him of who he used to be. The further he moved from his past, the easier it became to reshape the story of that past. And reshaping someone's past is the first step in reshaping their future. The brilliance of this strategy lies in its invisibility. There are no visible chains, only distance. No explicit orders, just influence. And influence, when it feels like love, is nearly impossible to detect. Harry's new reality became so intertwined with his relationship that questioning it might feel like questioning love itself. And that's how separation works. It doesn't divide you from people overnight. It simply replaces your old world with a new one, piece by piece, until the old version of you feels like a stranger. By this point, the transformation was complete, emotionally, socially, and psychologically. But as every carefully built image eventually faces a test, so would this one. Because control can only last as long as the illusion does, and cracks were already beginning to show. Every illusion, no matter how perfectly crafted, eventually begins to fracture. And for Harry and Meghan, those fractures didn't come from outsiders. They came from within the very structure they built to protect themselves. Control thrives on consistency, but the human spirit isn't built to live in performance forever. Sooner or later, the mask begins to slip. It started small, public moments that felt slightly off, a glance too sharp, a pause too long, a tone that shifted mid-sentence. The internet noticed before the media did. Clips went viral, slowed down, replayed, analyzed frame by frame. Every micro-expression became a data point in a larger theory. Maybe everything wasn't as harmonious as it seemed, but beyond the body language, the emotional dissonance was louder. When Meghan spoke, she radiated conviction, every word landing with precision and control. When Harry spoke, there was often a flicker of confusion, a hesitation that didn't exist before. The confidence of a man once sure of his role was replaced by a quiet searching, as if he was still trying to locate his identity in someone else's narrative. And that's when the cracks started widening. Interviews that once portrayed unity began revealing subtle contradictions. Stories shifted. Small details didn't align. One account contradicted the other, and suddenly, the narrative they'd worked so hard to protect began inviting questions instead of sympathy. For a couple who'd built their public identity on truth and authenticity, inconsistency was the one enemy they couldn't afford. But the deeper fracture wasn't public, it was internal. When someone's entire life becomes a constant performance of alignment, even minor disagreements feel like betrayal. Harry's instinct to protect his family clashed with Meghan's instinct to protect their image. What happens when those two instincts collide? The answer is simple: tension. Quiet, invisible, but powerful enough to alter the emotional atmosphere between them. Behind the scenes, friends began noticing changes. Rumors surfaced that Harry missed his old life more than he admitted, that he sometimes longed for the structure he'd once escaped. The world had painted him as free, but freedom without stability can feel like chaos. And chaos has a way of shaking even the strongest partnerships. And that's the paradox of their story. They left a system they felt controlled them, only to build one that controlled them even more. Their narrative had become their brand, and brands don't allow for imperfection. Every smile, every quote, every public moment had to serve the story. But stories built on control always crack under truth, and truth was beginning to leak through the edges. The illusion wasn't shattering yet, but it was trembling. And when an image that polished starts to tremble, the question isn't if it breaks, but when. As the illusion began to tremble, something even more profound began to unfold. Silence, but of a different kind. This wasn't the quiet compliance Harry had learned earlier. This was the silence that comes from emotional exhaustion, from living too long inside a narrative that doesn't breathe. When a person spends years defending their choices, justifying their happiness, and proving their independence, eventually, the energy runs out. And when that happens, silence becomes less of a shield and more of a symptom. The sparkle in the eyes fades. The sentences grow shorter. The passion that once fueled the fight turns into a dull resignation. Observers began noticing that Harry's presence felt faded. In public events, Meghan remained vibrant, eloquent, expressive, the heartbeat of their shared story. But Harry, though present, seemed like he was drifting, still smiling, still standing beside her, but somehow not with her. It wasn't visible defiance, it was quiet detachment. The kind that happens when the mind starts pulling back before the heart is ready to follow. And this is where psychology takes a darker turn. When someone loses autonomy for too long, the brain begins to seek small rebellions. They're not explosive, they're subtle. A missed meeting, a delayed response, a look that lingers a second too long elsewhere. These moments aren't defiance, they're survival. It's the subconscious trying to breathe through the cracks of control. For Harry, this rebellion took shape in small gestures, more time away, independent projects, moments where his tone in interviews carried flashes of his old personality, unfiltered, raw, unpredictable. And each time it happened, you could almost sense the conflict, the part of him that longed to speak freely, and the part that feared what that freedom might cost him. The silence between him and his old world grew louder too. Reports hinted at distance between him and his brother, awkwardness with friends, estrangement from former confidants. These were the people who once grounded him, who reminded him who he was. Losing them didn't just isolate him, it erased the mirrors that reflected his true self. And that's the true consequence of emotional dominance. Not anger, not arguments, but disconnection. The person you were slowly fades into the person you're expected to be. You stop recognizing your own voice, your own thoughts, your own desires. Until one day, you realize that the silence isn't protecting you anymore. It's consuming you. But silence, no matter how deep, never lasts forever. Because sooner or later, something breaks. A realization, a loss, a single moment that forces you to look in the mirror and confront what's left of yourself. And for Harry, that moment was coming. When the silence finally breaks, it doesn't explode, it echoes. It's not a loud declaration or a dramatic confrontation. It's quieter than that. It's the sound of someone remembering who they were before they forgot. And for Prince Harry, that memory is still inside him, buried beneath years of narrative, loyalty, and image management, but not gone. Every person who's ever lost themselves in another eventually reaches a moment of clarity. It might come during an argument, a long drive, or a quiet night when everything feels too still. For Harry, the spark of realization reportedly came through moments of reflection, returning to causes that once defined him, people who still saw him beyond the brand, beyond the narrative. Slowly, those echoes of his former self began to reappear. Freedom isn't always about leaving. Sometimes it's about remembering. Remembering your own voice, your own truth, your own power. But when you've lived too long inside someone else's design, remembering can feel like rebellion. Every attempt to rediscover your individuality feels like betrayal. Not because it is, but because you've been conditioned to believe unity requires surrender. The echo of freedom doesn't always bring peace. It brings conflict first, internal chaos. It forces you to ask questions you've avoided for years. Who am I outside of this story? What do I actually believe? What do I want? And the moment you start asking those questions, the illusion starts to crumble. Because illusions can't survive self-awareness. Observers have already noticed small shifts. Harry has taken on projects independently, spoken about mental health with more authenticity, and occasionally allowed emotion to break through the media polish. These aren't just PR choices. They're flickers of something deeper. The return of his own rhythm, the slow rebuilding of identity. And maybe that's what this entire journey has been about. Not control, not dominance, but rediscovery. Because the truth is, even the most carefully crafted influence can't suppress individuality forever. The human spirit always finds a way to echo, even from behind the walls it helped build. So perhaps this story doesn't end with a villain or a victim, but with a quiet awakening. The kind that starts not with rebellion, but with remembrance. The moment when Harry, once again, begins to sound like himself. And as those echoes grow louder, the world will be listening, not to the narrative, not to the headlines, but to the voice that was never truly gone, just waiting to return.